anticipated death of Christopher Columbus paved the way for further Spanish and Portuguese expeditions, which were to reveal the existence of South America, with more accurate data and instruments at their disposal. References by mapmakers stated this was a new world. As stories were told of this new world, many people were intrigued and wanted to see for themselves. Therefore, the United States was to become a nation of immigrants, filled with unwavering optimism and determination to succeed. However, before the settlement by Europeans, and prior to explorers charting the coastlines, the continent was inhabited by various native communities. It is theorized the first people came via Beringia, a land bridge that connected Russia and Alaska during the Ice Age. As the world temperature increased, the glaciers melted, raising the sea levels, and thereby closing the land bridge. Over time, these first hunter-gatherers migrated throughout the continent and were the ancestors of all Native Americans. A variety of people, societies, languages and cultures subsequently developed, most of which have been wiped out today. The land, climate and nature were significant influences in the lives and beliefs of those who occupied it. One of the earliest societies was the Mississippi culture, where archaeology has established that they built raised cities and ceremonial burial mounds, with urban settlements sustained by a commendable trading network. In the southwest, the Pueblos were known to have constructed complex multi-story villages built out of stone. To the northeast, 5 and later 6 nations banded together to form the Iroquois Confederacy. They developed a centralized democratic government which comprised of representative chiefs. It is argued that this confederacy was formed shortly before European contact by the peacemaker. However, the actual date is hearsay as no records exist. Perhaps the earliest noteworthy explorer was Leif Erikson, a Norse explorer who during the 11th century was blown off course en route to Greenland. This natural storm led to his discovery of the island today now known as Newfoundland, but the Norse named this land Vineland. A settlement was constructed on the northern tip of the island, but the settlement proved not to be viable and quickly faded. During the 5th century, Europe was enjoying a safe land passage reaching to India and even as far as China. These trade routes along the Silk Road enabled sources of valuable goods such as silks and spices to be traded. With the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, however, the land route to Asia became more difficult. Christopher Columbus was sponsored by Isabella of Castile and made his voyage with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Arguably, it was the voyages and expeditions of Christopher Columbus that were a significant factor in the evolution of American history. Guided by the maps of Tuscanelli, Columbus reached the Bahamas in 1492. He would undertake 3 more voyages, and as a reward for his success, he was appointed governor of Hispaniola. However, even for this time in history, Columbus committed multiple cruel and vile acts upon the natives, killing thousands, to the point where he was later brought back to Europe and imprisoned. The most significant factor in the demise of the natives at the time, however, was disease. The natives had no immunity to the foreign diseases, and it is estimated that 90% of the population were wiped out. Over the following centuries, numerous European powers embarked on colonization efforts, where they sought to exploit both the land, resources, and opportunities the continent offered. The Spanish focused their efforts at colonizing the Caribbean, Florida, and its conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires of South America. As news of this newfound continent reached Europe during the early 17th century, French immigrants were attracted to the fur trade and the wealth it could bring. They also had a desire to convert the natives to Catholicism and travelled further down the St. Lawrence River, laying the foundations for New France. The Dutch followed suit, establishing several forts, towns and trading posts along the Hudson River, which provided a network of trade. New Netherland, which the colony was known by, produced immense wealth for the Dutch. Other foreign nations began to envy the riches flowing out the Hudson River Valley. The English set up their first colony in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, which became a key exporter of tobacco. With tobacco plantations and colonies expanding, the need for labour became urgent. Indentured servants received paid passage to the Americas, along with food, clothing, and accommodation. Their contract was to work on plantations until their completion of service. With the European arrival, the Iroquois Confederacy became increasingly involved with the fur trade. Dutch colonists, and later English, craved the lucrative beaver furs from the Iroquois in exchange for firearms. The Iroquois Confederacy depleted beaver populations in their homeland and mobilized against other tribes in the Great Lakes region who were allied with the French. All this to gain access to new hunting and trapping grounds. The competitive nature of the fur trade led to decades of hostility and bloodshed between Native American tribes in their struggle to maintain and compete for relations with the colonies. In retaliation, the French invaded Iroquois villages and surrounding lands. Meanwhile, the Dutch lost New Netherland to the English during the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and New Amsterdam was renamed to New York. The Beaver Wars, as it was called, ended with the Great Peace in 1701, in which the Iroquois Confederacy, the British, and the French agreed to stop their campaign against tribes in the Ohio country and allowed the evicted tribes to return to their homeland. By the mid-17th century, European ships were sailing to Africa laden with goods, which were to be traded for slaves. These slaves were transported in harsh conditions on crowded ships bound for the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations. This resulted in more productivity for plantation owners. Further trade ships embarked to Europe, where a hungry market awaited highly priced merchandise. By the mid-18th century, France had laid claim to a vast amount of territory, whilst the English territory had evolved into 13 colonies. The English colonies were much smaller in land area compared to New France. However, they had a larger population. In 1754, the French-Indian War broke out between Britain and France over disputed lands in the Ohio River Valley. France began the construction of forts in the region. Britain sent troops to stop the construction, and conflict escalated into the 7 Years' War, a colonial war spread over several continents. The conflict ended in British victory and saw large amounts of French territory in the New World reassigned to Britain. However, following the 7 Years' War, the Crown amassed huge debts. In order to claw back monies, the British government imposed heavy taxes on the colonies. The first taxation was the Sugar Act, followed by the Stamp Act, where papers, magazines, and other documents needed to be produced in Britain and have a stamp tax on them. The colonists seriously disliked these taxes, promoting protest and boycotting of British goods. They believed that there should be no taxation without representation in Parliament. The British were forced to revoke the Stamp Act due to the negative consequences for British businesses. Instead, they introduced new taxes on glass, tea, lead, oil, which resulted in more protests, as these products were essential to the colonies. The Crown initially sent 1,000 troops to Boston to assert control. On March 5, 1770, conflict escalated when the protesters started throwing stones and snowballs at the guards of the custom house. In the skirmish, shots were fired, killing 5 protesters, becoming known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, disgusted by further taxation, American patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native American Indians. They boarded a British ship and began throwing tea cargo into the harbour. The British Crown, driven with anger, sent 4,000 more troops to Boston, concluding with direct British rule. The British controlled Boston, but the Americans controlled the countryside and began arming and training militias, known as the Minutemen. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met at Philadelphia. 56 delegates from 12 colonies arrived to discuss the reduction of taxes and a response to the Intolerable Acts, where Massachusetts had been stripped of self-government by the British Parliament. They sent a message to Britain and they responded with more regulations and increased army presence. Massachusetts was declared in a state of rebellion. British Commander Lieutenant General Thomas Gage was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest the leaders in the countryside. On the night of the 18th of April, 1775, Commoner Paul Revere rode ahead of British forces to warn leaders the British were coming. American militia met the British forces at Lexington, retreated back to Concord, and with more troops arriving, they overwhelmed the British, who retreated back to Boston, where the city came under siege. At the Second Continental Congress, the militias were reorganized to form the Continental Army. They appointed General George Washington as leader. Right, I need a break. I need a cup of tea. Yeah. British reinforcements arrived, led by General William Howe. The Battle of Bunker Hill saw victory for the British, but the price to pay was a substantial loss of life, and Boston remained under siege. General George Washington arrived in Boston the following month, and continued the siege through autumn and winter. In March 1776, artillery arrived. General George Washington ordered them to overlook the city, forcing the British to evacuate. Thomas Jefferson drafted up the official Declaration of Independence, and the final text was approved on July 4, 1776. A year later, they fashioned the Articles of Confederation, which served as its first constitution.